Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to be back at the Bavard bar, and as described, I'm going to be talking about the eating habits of politicians. And so I'm going to begin by just telling you a little story about Peter Mandelson. For the younger members of the audience who don't know who Peter Mandelson is, he was the third part of New Labour along with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. He was very slick, London, Islington politician, but he had a constituency up in the north of England in Hartlepool. And this is a story about some fish and chips. So Peter Mandelson goes to a chippy in his constituency of Hartlepool, and he asks for haddock, chips, and some of that guacamole. Now clearly, as of course we all know, the foodstuff in question was mushy peas, which the Metropolitan Mandelson mistakes for avocado dip. Now the best thing about this story is that it is utterly untrue. But it's also eminently believable, and that is the best thing about a story about a politician, is that often it doesn't really matter if it's true because it'll spread around like wildfire. It did happen. Somebody did ask for some of that guacamole, but it was a young American intern who was helping them out with the election who went into the chip shop and asked for guacamole. But because it fits so perfectly with the image that was around in the media of Peter Mandelson, who was, to be honest, comfortably middle class, but certainly knew what mushy peas were, that it spread like wildfire, and he couldn't shake it off for the rest of his career. Now, I spent a lot of time trying to work out the origins, who the mischief maker is, and sources are split between it being Neil Kinnock and John Prescott. To be honest, a lot of sources point to Kinnock, but personally I'd like to believe it was Prescott, who had a turbulent relationship with Peter Mandelson. Not least when he compared him to a crab during the 1997 election campaign. And I still don't really know why and how John Prescott ended up being... This is a Chinese mitten crab in a jar. And Prescott gets presented with this crab in a jar on the campaign trail and decides... He says to journalists, you know what his name is? He's called Peter. Do you think you'll get on the executive, Peter? I'm still utterly baffled by the continuing appeal of a political photo shoot with crustaceans. Here's George Osborne with some giant crabs. If this was politicians holding crabs, it would be a slightly shorter talk, but I do have a number of other pictures on file. Now, Mandelson's not the only politician to fall foul of fish and chips. Tony Blair, whilst he was Prime Minister, Tony Blair's tastes in food become more and more proletariat. The closer he gets into the corridors of power, here's Tony eating a chip. Now, so in 1993, when Tony's the MP for Islington, he's Shadow Home Secretary, I think, at this point, and he contributes a recipe to the Islington Cookbook. He was not MP for Islington, sorry, he was Sedgefield, but he lived in Islington. And the Islington Cookbook had a contribution from Tony, which was fettuccine with olive oil, some dried tomatoes and capers. Fast forward about 11 years and Tony's Prime Minister, and he divulges that his favourite food is good old-fashioned British fish and chips. It's all about the audiences that you're playing to. Now, here's Thatcher. One anecdote that's frequently bandied around about Margaret Thatcher is that she invented Mr. Whippy ice cream. Now, the process of making Mr. Whippy ice cream involves reducing the amount of milk involved in production of the ice cream, which seems wholly in character with Thatcher's desire to remove milk from people through any means necessary. And Thatcher did study chemistry. She's one of the few British Prime Ministers to have a science degree. And she did work for a company called Lyons that created the propellant gas, but sadly, the propellant gas was invented a good 10 years before Thatcher ever graduated from Oxford. The Royal Society felt this was so important that after Thatcher's death, they weighed in on this and asserted, the Royal Society said, an oft-told anecdote in British left circles associates Thatcher with the invention of soft ice cream, which added air, lowered quality and raised profits. There is no firm evidence that Thatcher directly assisted in its invention. Now, she may not have indulged in ice cream, but we know quite a lot about Thatcher's diet, including the bizarre measures that she went to while she was fighting the 1979 election. Now, it's well documented that Thatcher survived on only about 3 hours of sleep a week. But what's less commented on is the fact that in the run-up to the election, she was eating no fewer than 28 eggs a week. The 30-year rule means that parliamentary papers are released 30 years after they're written, because basically everyone involved in it is either retired or dead. This is Thatcher's campaign diet, which is incredible. Every single day has at least 4 eggs. There's one day on there when you have an egg for breakfast, 2 eggs for breakfast, 2 eggs for lunch, 2 eggs for dinner. The only respite from this grapefruit and black coffee, steak and lettuce diet is where Thatcher's written whiskey with the meat in the margin. I'm going to return to the subject of ice cream, because if there's one thing I've learned from all of these studies into the eating habits of politicians, is that politicians bloody love an ice cream. Here's Tony and Gordon with some non-Thatcher manufactured Mr. Whippy ice creams. And this is one of my favourite pictures of politicians eating ice cream, mostly because of the fact that at the time this photograph was taken, these two hated each other more than they hated anybody in the world. And it's a photo shoot. I think they're in Wales somewhere, and they're on the beach, and it's March. It's not ice cream weather, but they get sent to an ice cream. Tony goes to the ice cream, and he buys them. Jonathan Powell, Tony's chief of staff, says Blair strolled over to an ice cream van to go buy a couple of 99s. "Here, Gordon," he said, calling on the other man to get his cornet. And Jonathan Powell, Tony's chief of staff, said, "I wanted to throw up." And the head of the civil service, for some reason, commented on the ice cream incident, and he said, "I don't think Blair was much of an ice cream person." And Brown certainly wasn't. Here's another politician eating ice cream. They picked the wrong Miliband. I'm going to tell you about a slightly, possibly far-fetched theory I've got, which is about how a banana affected the outcome of the 2010 election. At the time of the Labour Party conference in 2009, Gordon Brown's premiership was at its lowest point. Rumours were afoot around the whole conference that someone was going to swoop in, namely this man, David Miliband, the Foreign Secretary, in some kind of coup, seize power, become the new leader of the Labour Party, re-energise them, and sweep to victory in the next election. It was pretty much the top news story in the whole of conference, and then for some reason, David Miliband did this. And strolled along right at the seafront, clutching a banana. No one will ever know why. But this is the moment that David Miliband ruled himself out of the leadership race. And the rest is history. Incidentally, Gordon Brown is no stranger to bananas. Whilst he was Prime Minister, he was furious about the fact that newspaper cartoonists would draw him as a big fat man. And he wasn't particularly fat, not that there's any problem in being fat, but he's a very tall man, he's about 6'2", but they would always draw him as a fat man, and one of the things he did to try and shake this off was try and kick the habit of eating 9 Kit Kats a day, by switching each Kit Kat for a banana, which would imply that Gordon Brown, at the height of his premiership, was eating 63 bananas a week. I don't really have any comment on that. It's just a remarkable statistic. Now, no discussion of the eating habits of politicians would be complete, unfortunately. Oh, I'm so sorry. Was that me?
That was me.
Would sadly be complete without talking about Ed Miliband and the bacon sandwich, although it still makes me sad. Did this lose Labour the election? Their own investigation into what went wrong in 2015 is a 70-page document. I've read it. 2 pages of it, of the 70 pages, are headlined "The Bacon Sandwich Incident." It certainly struck terror into the political classes, so much that David Cameron became the first person ever to try and eat a hot dog using a knife and fork. This is a very clear determination not to be photographed awkwardly eating a meat and bread product, despite the fact that we know Cameron knows how to eat a hot dog. It's just spin. This is principally a talk about the eating habits of politicians, but I'm just going to take a really quick detour through some of their drinking habits. In Tony Blair's remarkable novel, A Journey, he confesses to developing a drinking problem during his time at Number 10. Although, given that the extent of his excesses amounted to a whiskey and gin or tonic before dinner, a glass of wine, sometimes a couple of glasses of wine or a half a bottle with dinner. I think if this is the gauge Tony's using, then I think a great deal of the audience have got a Tony Blair-style drinking problem. Not judging. Cheers. But in terms of politicians and booze, the only time you're ever allowed to have a drink in the House of Commons, in the Commons chamber, is when you are the Chancellor of the Exchequer and you are delivering the budget. The last person to have an alcoholic drink in the Commons chamber, therefore, apart from people with hip flasks who I'm not counting because it's not allowed, is Ken Clarke delivering the final budget of John Major's government. All his 4 successive Chancellors, Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling, George Osborne and Phil Hammond, have just sipped at water. Whether I emailed John McDonnell and asked him if elected Shadow Chancellor whether he will have a drink, and he hasn't replied to me. But I don't think anyone's going to top Gladstone, who used to pontificate on the state of the nation's finances while sipping at a glass of sherry with a beaten egg whipped into it. I dread to think. Okay, so obviously, I don't know if he's really a politician, but here he is. Most famous politician to enjoy a wee drink or 8, the 3-time leader of UKIP here. And he's rarely seen without a pint and a cigarette in his hand. He did actually give up smoking for a bit, but took it up again during the EU referendum. And he said he didn't believe it was bad for you. And I do know a lot of the talk around the EU referendum was about how experts aren't actually right, but I think that's taking a little bit of a step too far. There's a remarkable interview that he has with the Financial Times, where this poor hack is sitting there trying to interview Farage, who drinks 6 pints of ale, a bottle of wine and 2 large ports, and then kicks off when the interviewer goes for goat's cheese rather than lamb chops. But given that this considerable bar tab is for a lunch meeting, unfortunately on the FT, and then Farage goes back to work, or whatever he does, it suggests that maybe this perpetual pint is less a publicity stunt and more a necessity. What's difficult about giving this talk is that politics moves very fast, and so obviously you have to keep updating it in order to make sure it keeps in touch with the current crop of party leaders. And for all I know, Vince Cable's been in a pie eating contest and I've just missed it. But so it was obviously a godsend during the last election when Theresa May proved that she was not only never seen a chip before, but was bewildered and disgusted as to what these weird sticks of potato are. Ed Miliband, the newly sassy Ed Miliband, immediately tweets her going, "Theresa, we should talk." A politician who's fallen foul of an unfortunate photo shoot with food. Now, Theresa May, whilst Home Secretary, one thing I have learned, I've read far too much of the Daily Mail online to find out what sort of food Theresa likes. She's got 100 cookbooks, who'd known. But one thing she does really like is curry. And here she is eating some curry. She famously likes spicy food. And this is a little bit awkward because as Home Secretary, Theresa May oversaw a slightly draconian regime, I think is putting it slightly lightly. Here she is cutting the ribbon on a Indian restaurant in her constituency in Maidenhead. She opened 2. She was the honoured guest of the local MP for 2 different Indian restaurants, and then her own Home Office border service shut them down and deported members of staff. Which obviously is pretty terrible in some ways, and also is Theresa May just literally depriving herself of the curry she claims to love. This is a non-partisan political talk. We're going to be talking about the marrow. Now, a bit like trying to track down Corbyn's policies on Europe, it's difficult to find out too many interesting facts about what he likes to eat. He is a vegetarian, which meant that the 2017 election had more vegetarian party leaders than any election in history, and probably in future. Tim Farron of the Liberal Democrats is a vegetarian. Caroline Lucas, co-leader of the Green Party, is a vegetarian. Corbyn's a vegetarian. I think that's probably as many as we're going to get. Tim Farron's staffers described his campaign trail as a rubbery tofu circuit, which suggests that vegetarian he may be, but he can't track down some good food. I live in Brighton and spotted Corbyn in Brighton's cut-price vegetarian all-you-can-eat Indian restaurant about 3 years ago at Labour Party conference, eating their happy hour £3.50 all-you-can-eat vegetarian curry. No doubt as a result of austerity, it's now £5.50 for all-you-can-eat curry, and I definitely didn't spot him in there this year. But his attempts to court the Labour vote in Scotland were summed up by a journalist thrust a can of iron brew into his hand. And Corbyn had never tasted iron brew, was not about to start, and a growing Scottish PR fracas was kicking off. And the then leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Kezia Dugdale, which is it was a terrible job that nobody would ever really want to have, tried to patch things up and basically made Jeremy drink some iron brew on a train. And here he is before, and here he is after. He described the experience as like nothing I've ever tasted. Now, one thing I'm often asked about the eating habits of politicians is the eating habits of Boris Johnson, because he's such a grotesque caricature of a human that people expect him to have alarmingly freaky eating habits. It's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it. Boris Johnson is probably the only politician to have a 3-course breakfast. Okay, so basically, the first course is quite normal. He has coffee and marmalade on toast, although he substitutes butter for I can't believe it's not butter, which in my eyes is the act of a Philistine, but I'm not going to judge. After that, things get a bit weird. After his toast and marmalade and a cup of coffee, normal breakfast. Here's Boris holding a giant fish. After the toast and marmalade, he wanders around the kitchen reading the news and he eats some cold spaghetti or a chop or two. And then after the spaghetti or the chop, there's one more part of breakfast still to come. He claims there's often birthday cakes in the fridge, which I'll eat for breakfast. Now, until he divorced his wife, Boris has 2 children and 1 wife. That's 4 people. That's 8 months of the year, minimum, where there aren't birthdays. Where does the birthday cake come from? Now, one thing politicians are often asked is the price of a pint of milk. And keen not to be caught out by this classic trap, Tim Farron not only did his research, but he arranged an entire photo shoot of him holding milk. And when I say an entire photo shoot, I mean an entire photo shoot. I mean hundreds and hundreds of photographs of Tim Farron holding milk. You can still download all of these from the Lib Dem website if that's your cup of tea. But the thing is, no, I mean, there is a bit more of a serious point to this, because politicians are under an immense amount of pressure and also have to face an incredibly vicious news cycle. And John Prescott, a few years ago, admitted to having an eating disorder during the entire time he was in Parliament, and was met with a strange mix. There was a lot of sympathy, but there was also a lot of mockery. And John Prescott, he's working class, he's big and fat, and there was the idea, oh, you don't have an eating disorder, John, but actually, eating disorders are immensely common. And the details of the story were, it's quite a depressing thing. It's very bold for John Prescott as a man in such a high position of power to speak out about this. I think it's applaudable. But one of the things he said, which is one of the things I found quite interesting about this, is that he said, whenever I go to Mr. Chu's in Hull, my favourite Chinese restaurant in the whole world, I eat my way through the entire menu. Now, I looked up the menu of Mr. Chu's Chinese restaurant in Hull, and as many people who have been to a Chinese restaurant will know, there's hundreds and hundreds of dishes. And the one thing I find quite astonishing is that how he kept it quiet. How the sight of the Deputy Prime Minister ordering over 100 dishes to his table in a Chinese restaurant could possibly have escaped media attention so far. But it is difficult, and some politicians stoop to much, much lower levels. Here's John Gummer and his 4-year-old daughter Cordelia eating a BSE-infected burger. This was at the midst of the BSE crisis, and he tries to get his kid to eat a burger. She's notably unimpressed, and Gummer's career never recovers. I'm happy to say that my brother used to work with Cordelia Gummer, and she is still alive and well. But it's difficult. You're a politician. You're trying to present yourself as a person of the people. Here's Ed Miliband, Ed Balls and Rachel Reeves going into Greggs to eat some sausage rolls at the height of the pasty tax furore. You want to enjoy pasties from Greggs as much as the next time, but you're also working an 18-plus hour day in front of a crazy news cycle. Of course, you're not going to buy a pint of milk from the local shop very often. You barely have time to see your family. Here's George Osborne eating an expensive burger. Now, there are a lot of things to criticise George Osborne about, but this burger costs £6.75. George Osborne is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, not anymore. But basically, you can't take the man to task for spending £6.75 on a burger in Whitehall. If you've tried to get a cheap burger that's not in... Okay, you could go to McDonald's. I guess you could go to McDonald's. But he doesn't, you know... I don't think this is the issue. You've got to be everything to everyone as a politician. You've got to shovel down fish and chips and mushy peas, not guacamole, 1 minute, and serve up bruschetta the next. And so, I mean, I think that basically I've built a whole talk around like laughing at politicians eating stupid things, but there's probably some more serious issues that I don't have time to address. Now, this has principally been about British politicians. I'm going to wind up now just with a couple of minutes. This is, I'm not going to show you a picture of a meeting because it's horrendous. The President of the United States' hotel rider got leaked, and it's incredible. I don't know if you can read this, but 3 gallons of buttermilk is still going to be my favourite. 3 shoehorns delivered to the hotel suite, 24 peeled hard-boiled eggs, 6 boxes of double-stuffed Oreos unpacked, stacked in rows of 8. 3 microwave ovens, do not plug in microwaves, we will do this. And I know why they've written this, because Trump's team thought Obama was spying on them through the microwaves. Maybe this is just what people eat in America, but it just really horrifies me every time I look at this. And on a penultimate note, Mitterrand, the great French reforming president, was dying. He knew he was dying. This is an ortolan bunting, which he ate. The ortolan bunting is a tiny songbird, which people don't really eat in France anymore. It's against the law. But Mitterrand was dying and he didn't care. You drown it alive in brandy. You cook it and you eat it whole, bones and all. Whilst you're eating an ortolan bunting, you cover yourself in a white napkin in order to eat it, because people don't want God to see them eating these tiny songbirds. After that, he didn't eat anything else and he died 10 days later. And just as a closing point, in case you thought British politics was the pinnacle of unusual eating habits, his former Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, eating an onion like an apple. And this has always astonished me. Does Tony Abbott not know what an onion is? Is this just what he regularly does with an onion? Is this something he regularly does with an onion? I asked myself. It turns out yes! It turns out Tony Abbott has eaten a number of onions at various points on the campaign trail. He's no longer Prime Minister of Australia, leaving him to spend more time with his onions. And that's pretty much about it. And I'd like to thank you very much for
So there we are, a fabulous final Bavard to finish on. Does anybody have any questions for Chris and the eating habits? Anybody want to delve deeper into what our politicians eat? We've learnt a lot. We know what some of them like. What about well, you said about May. Any others of the current crop that you've?
Well, what's obviously leading the news at the moment is that Andrea Leadsom, leader of the House of Commons, and a number of other of the more sort of like Brexity MPs met for what they call the Pizza Summit, which essentially means they go to Andrea Leadsom's office and order a load of pizza and plot to get what they want about Brexit. And I think from what I found out, there's a lot of takeaway food in Whitehall. When the financial crisis was at its height, Alistair Darling ended up spending about £700 on curry for all the heads of all the banks, who he'd locked in a room in number 11 and made them come to some kind of arrangement. And the only interruption was more and more chicken tikka masalas coming in to keep the finance people all pepped up on curry. And similarly, the Pizza Summit, I'm endeavouring to find out that I have no evidence so far as to what sort of pizza all the Brexiteers are eating in Andrea Leadsom's office, and I would really like to find out.
Brilliant. Any questions for Chris? Anybody? Yes.
Apart from the knowing that Amber Rudd frequents the Landed Green Ginger in the Old Town sometimes early on a Saturday morning, have any knowledge of her eating habits?
You know, I should have done some research before I came to Amber Rudd's constituency on her eating habits. Obviously, I'm
You'll make something up.
Ducks, baby ducks. No, just baby ducks, conveyor belt like a sushi restaurant, little duck. Don't quote me. I don't have the budget for a slander suit.
We will. Any final questions for Chris? And I'm just looking for any hands that are waving at me. If there are no final questions, then can we thank Chris for a fabulous time today?
Oh, sorry, can I just say, I know this might be a bit cheeky, I've got these little politician books that I made. They're not all of them eating, some of them are of them eating. They're slightly misprinted, so I'm flogging them off for £2 each. If anyone wants a little bit of politician to take away with them, don't do that, but do come and buy a little bit.
Sorry,
well, I've got a picture of Ed Balls and Andy Burnham on a swing. Got a picture of Nick Clegg looking at a hedgehog. You know, just the basics.